While we're reading, I'm just going to point out in between each chapter just something to pay attention to. I'll point out at different parts of the reading things that are relevant to that particular message. So again, by us tapping into it in our own personal level and as a nation, we acquire the merit to have divine intervention against the pitfalls that we face in our life and also as a nation.
Keep this in mind as they're reading the Megillah and have the right kind of intention so that they can fasten themselves to the energy of those events that are being done. Nowadays, in order to access all this energy and to affirm our connection to the events then and to express our recognition that all of that was a series of divinely guided events and our gratitude for all that, so part of that is that we fulfill this commandment, this mitzvah of reading the Megillah. And part of reading the Megillah is having the appropriate intention, understanding it slightly deeper level. So I'm going to go through chapter by chapter. I'm going to read it from notes. I apologize for that. Chapter 1 introduces Achashverosh, the king, and you can see that the atmosphere of the party is of a degenerate culture, of a leader who's drunk and self-indulgent, weak. And at this great feast, Achashverosh was using kelim shonik, vessels that were, according to tradition, this is not in the Megillah itself. The king was using vessels that were taken from the temple which had recently been destroyed, the Jewish people drinking Achashverosh's wine from the holy vessels of the temple. And according to traditional interpretations, this was one of the reasons that God allowed for Haman's nefarious plan to destroy the Jewish people. And you'll notice that the person who's reading the Megillah will have a special mournful tune when they're reading a piece of that description. And it was only later when they repented for that, so to speak, that they were able to obtain the divine help to be saved from that plan. Second chapter introduces Mordechai. Then we're introduced to Esther, and we're told that her name is Hadassah. When Mordechai's genealogy is read, the whole congregation will read together and will say, Ish Yemini. Yemini meaning Benjamin, Binyamin in Hebrew. Ish Yemini, descended from Benjamin, younger brother of Joseph. So there's a great significance attached to the fact that he is a descendant of Benjamin. And throughout the Megillah we can see many, many, many parallels to the story of Joseph and also Binyamin's part in it. It's mirrored by Binyamin's descendant, Mordechai. And we'll be seeing some of those parallels, and some of those I would leave to the reader to kind of notice on their own. Chapter 3 introduces Haman. The issue is a matter of bowing to Haman. And of course, who was Mordechai's great uncle, Joseph? If you remember, he had those dreams, and in the dreams there were sheaves of wheat bowing, there were stars and the moon and the sun bowing to him. And here we have, again, a story involving Joseph, his great-great-great-nephew, Mordechai, and he's being told he has to bow down to Haman. First part of the plot. It's the casting of lots, in other words, some kind of like a lottery, but it was basically tapping into a certain type of magic, of chance, of randomness, that this was an augury, an auspicious day to destroy the Jewish people. It's kind of the randomness, the tohu vavohu, which at creation God turned into order, the opposite of free will, choice, and intention. So now, although there were lots that were cast by the Jewish people at various times, even mentioned in the Torah as part of religious, like for example the Selah Azazel, this was Haman's use of lots for a very object purpose, to exterminate the Jewish people just because their leader refused to bow. It's a perversion of the practice of lottery, using this kind of black magic to help in a genocide just to serve his ego. Now you also note that the day that he chose, the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar, which was set for the destruction of the Jews, that in the end becomes turned upside down, V'nehapachu, which is the theme of the Megillah, of the holiday. That very day was the day that the Jews ended up having their victory over this enemy. That's a special energy of this holiday, turning something very, very bad into something good. Chapter 4, though God is not mentioned, this chapter is the key in seeing the story as one of divine intervention. In this chapter, the passages from 13 to 16, you have the conversation between Mordechai and Esther. He tells her that she should intercede. The words that he says and that she says afterwards tell very clearly that both of these protagonists understood that the events that control the fate of the Jewish people were at the highest level controlled by divine rather than magic or just the human level. So when you're following along in chapter 4, take a look at those words and you'll see what I mean. That clearly none of those things make any sense unless there is some kind of a level of divine intervention that they're appealing to. And you'll see that the person reading the Megillah will have a special tune when Esther says, Kasher avadati, avadati. In other words, I accept upon myself the possibility that I will fail and I will pay with my life. And so she's willing to sacrifice her life in the same way that Mordechai was willing to sacrifice his life and not bow down to Haman. And this is an important element in achieving the divine intervention. I mentioned the story of Joseph, that this is very similar to. Joseph standing before Paro, he credits God with the power of interpreting dreams, and that's an important aspect which earned him God's help. Mordechai makes it known to Esther that help will come to the Jewish people via divine intervention, and everything turned around because of that. And when we read the Megillah and we attach ourselves to that idea that yes, we're seeing all this as having been divine intervention rather than just chance, then by affirming that, we're able to attach ourselves to that and hopefully also gain some measure of divine intervention in our favor. Chapter 5, we have Esther approaching the king. What she had asked Mordechai to do was to ask all the Jewish people to come together and fast. And chapter 5 starts, and it was on the third day of a 3-day fast. So she's using the fact that all these Jewish people are praying for her success. She's coming on that third day, and she's approaching the king. Now, that's a key. God isn't mentioned, but it's clear that they're fasting because they're looking for divine intervention. And note her strategy. She doesn't ask Haman anything. She doesn't mention Haman to the king. She doesn't ask the king to save the Jews. All she says is asking the king to come to a party that she's going to make, and she tells him that she's going to invite Haman. And many people talk about the strategy, but you can see that, in fact, the strategy ends up working. That Haman is so full of himself, comes to the party, and he thinks he's very, very high up in the hierarchy for being invited that way, and Mordechai doesn't bow to him, and he says nothing is worth it. And his wife Zeresh, take a look at her role in chapter 5. She recommends hanging Mordechai. Now, that's where things turn around. Chapter 6, that night the king can't sleep, and chance plays a sudden role. Of all things, Mordechai's name pops up in a story that he saved the king from a plot. You'll see that when they read it. And then just then, in the night when he's being read this story of Mordechai's intervention to save his life, he hears Haman in the courtyard. And why is Haman there? To set up a tree to hang Mordechai. And you'll look at the conversation, you'll see how pompous Haman is and how he misinterprets what the king says, and why the king suddenly begins to suspect Haman of perhaps trying to take over. And the chapter ends, the servants are coming and rushing to take Haman to the second banquet. Chapter 7, that's the end of Haman. At the second banquet, you'll look and you'll see what the dynamics are. It's very interesting. Somebody points out a tree, they hang him, and again, when the king is drunk, he takes this decision. Chapter 8, well, what happens to the decree? Decree to destroy the Jewish people. Well, that culture had a certain belief that they couldn't overturn a rule of the king if it was stamped in the signet ring of the king, as you'll see. So what they did, instead of canceling that date of the 13th day of the 12th month for the Jews to be destroyed, they gave the Jews the right to defend themselves. And that day turned into a day of great victory. Chapter 9, you can see in verses 24-25 the idea of vinapachu, turning things upside down. And everything happened as it did basically because the Jews acted in unity and fasted, and the holiday is celebrated by taking responsibility for each other, giving money to the poor, and acts of unity, and sending food to each other, besides the alms to the poor, fasting as they did, and so on. And all that is part of tapping into the same energy. Chapter 10 is politics. and the elevation of Mordechai, very similar words and position to what happened with Joseph. And then a little phrase of Ratzui l'rov achav, which is interpreted in various ways as possibly some people not being so happy with Mordechai. And again, there's a lot to say about that.